Hi class, welcome back to Sports Nutrition. We're in the second week of our course and this week's topic is macronutrients. The objectives of this lesson are to identify the functions of each of the three macronutrients, to differentiate between monosaccharides and disaccharides, compare and contrast phospholipids, sterols, and triglycerides, to list the essential and non-essential amino acids, calculate the calories in food by applying what's known as physiological fuel values for carbohydrates, protein, and fat, and finally to describe the changes to the nutrition facts panel by 2018. So let's get started. In the first lecture, I talked about some of the essential nutrients and that they all have functions in our body. So the purpose of this slide is really to kind of break that out a little bit more for you. So as you can see in the far left of this slide, carbohydrates, protein, and lipid really all function to provide energy. Carbs and protein provide 4 calories per gram, whereas lipids provide 9. In the middle of this slide, you'll see that there are several essential nutrients that promote growth and development. Proteins, lipids, some vitamins, some minerals, and water. So that's pretty much all of them except carbohydrates. And finally, proteins, lipids, some vitamins, some minerals, and water would help to regulate body processes. When we think about macronutrients, remember that they do provide us energy in the form of calories. Sometimes they're referred to as fuel values. Some textbooks call them physiological fuel values. Kind of describe it however you want. Just make sure you are very familiar with these numbers because we'll be applying these throughout the course of the entire semester. So remember, carbohydrates and protein provide similar amounts of calories per gram, and that's 4. Lipids is the one that really provides us the most, so it's pretty energy dense because it gives us 9 calories per gram. And then I haven't really talked about alcohol, but I thought I'd bring it up in this lecture. Alcohol provides 7 calories per gram. I started because alcohol is actually not an essential nutrient. Remember, there are 6 of them, and alcohol is actually not one of the essential nutrients. That means our body doesn't really need it. However, it does give us calories. So if you ever heard the term empty calories and alcohol, some people like to think about alcohol as just something that gives us extra calories in our diet, but we don't really need it or use it for anything. Okay, so I'm going to break down each of these macronutrients one by one. We'll go into a little bit more deeper detail in comparison to the first lecture. So carbohydrates, remember, they're classified as simple or complex. So this slide really kind of highlights the simple carbohydrates and then ends with polysaccharides, which is a complex carbohydrate. Monosaccharides, again, simple carbohydrate. Mono means 1, so there's 1 sugar molecule. Disaccharides, di meaning 2, you have 2 sugar molecules bonded together. Oligosaccharides means that there's many monosaccharides, so it's really defined as more than 3 sugar units or individual monosaccharides linked together. That can vary, right? So you can have either 3 or 5 or 7 or 9. It's kind of a broad term in that sense. And polysaccharides means that you have many sugar molecules linked together. Sometimes you can't even count how many. So that's why the term poly is used. In terms of monosaccharides, again, simple carbohydrate, there are 3 main ones to know about. These include glucose, fructose, and galactose. I listed their kind of chemical formula here. You don't really need to memorize that. I know it's listed in your textbook. Just thought I'd write that in case you're interested. So glucose, for example, contains 6 carbon rings, 12 hydrogens, and 6 oxygens, if you're wondering how to interpret that. Glucose is really of interest because eventually all carbohydrates break down into glucose. So we digest, let's say, a piece of bread, and then it gets broken down into glucose, and we absorb that. What happens after we absorb that is we use that directly for energy by all of our body cells. When we get too much glucose in our diet, let's say you just feasted, you overate on a bunch of bread and let's say anything else, some sweets or pie, eventually that glucose will be stored. The storage form of glucose is referred to as glycogen. And we only can store glycogen in 2 places in our body, and that's the muscles and liver. Why would you want to store that glycogen for later use? Well, Think about this in terms of sports nutrition. If you're an athlete and you're going to go through an endurance event, you're going to burn through your energy pretty quickly, and you want to then draw on your reserves. Those reserves would be glycogen, and again, that's in the muscle and the liver. Another interesting thing about glycogen is that we can't store as much as we want of it. They have limits. So for example, the muscle and liver have a capacity to store only a certain amount of glycogen. One other scenario is if we have too much glucose, once we've kind of fulfilled those glycogen loads, that can be converted to fat. And that's when people start to gain weight if you're not an athlete or an active person. But yes, that extra glucose can be converted to fat, and we can store that also for energy if needed at a later time. What about the other two simple sugars? So fructose and galactose. Fructose, I kind of think of it as the fruit sugar. We find fructose actually in fruit like bananas or pears. We also can find fructose in processed foods. If you look at food labels and the ingredient list, you can see fructose is commonly added to some processed foods. And really the liver is responsible for metabolizing fructose. It converts it to glucose. Galactose, on the other hand, is kind of, it helps to form a milk sugar called lactose. So next time you drink a cup of skim milk or 2% or whole milk, whatever you're drinking, the primary carbohydrate or sugar in milk is lactose. And the body basically can convert galactose to glucose for energy metabolism. So collectively, you can see how these simple sugars eventually are converted to glucose and can be used for energy by the body. Okay, so moving on to disaccharides. So remember, these are two sugar units linked together. And really how I've broken this out is listed the three main disaccharides, which include sucrose, lactose, and maltose, and how they're linked together. So sucrose, for example, is formed from the monosaccharide glucose plus fructose. Lactose is formed from glucose and galactose. Maltose is formed from glucose plus glucose. So monosaccharides help to form disaccharides is the main point really of this slide. Plant polysaccharides. So now we're getting into these complex carbohydrates. Really there's two major forms when I think about polysaccharides and how I was taught about them. There's starch and fiber. So we'll start with starch. So starch is really abundant in plants. It accounts for pretty much 50% of the total carbohydrate intake of all Americans. And the term complex carbohydrate pretty much refers to dietary starch. Fiber, on the other hand, is interesting because fiber is actually a non-digestible carbohydrate. It's non-digestible because our body doesn't actually have the enzymes to break fiber down. However, fiber has many health benefits that we're going to talk about coming up here. And when I think about fiber, there's two main forms. There's water-soluble fiber and water-insoluble fiber. So I've listed just some examples of those two types on the slide. And fiber really can be found in different food sources, but mostly plant sources. So fruits, vegetables, and your whole grains would be really good sources of dietary fiber. Okay, we'll talk a little bit more about glycogen. I know I'm kind of hopping around here, but these are all important concepts to know. So glycogen, again, storage polysaccharide found in the muscle and liver. It can be synthesized from glucose during a process known as gluconeogenesis. And I know that's a fancy word, but all it really means is that you're generating new glucose to use for energy. And there's also another fancy word called glycogenolysis, and that's when we break down that glycogen to provide a rapid source of glucose. Could you think about a scenario when you might need to do that? I often think about if I was starving or going under starvation. I haven't introduced any food in my body for a really long time, so I need to draw on my reserves. How do I do that? How do I get glucose to all the cells in my body for energy? Well, you would use glycogenolysis, right? You can break down the storage form of glycogen that you already have to get glucose into your cells. So hopefully that makes sense. So back on fiber, like I said, fiber is a pretty complicated carbohydrates. And this graph came actually from one of my graduate textbooks, and I don't expect you to memorize this by any means. I know it's pretty complex, but just kind of wanted to show you all the things that fiber does for us. That's why you hear all about fiber in the news and the media. We publish in Science a lot about fiber because it really does a lot for us. So one of the two main things I want to point out, that soluble fiber, which is kind of highlighted in these blue boxes, and finally in the red box on the bottom, the main benefit of consuming a soluble fiber is that it helps to lower your serum cholesterol. So if you're someone who has high cholesterol, or a family member who maybe had or suffers from heart disease and they need to lower their cholesterol, as a nutritionist or dietitian, you might want to recommend including more soluble fiber in your diet. On the far right of the slide, other benefits of fiber is really that it can make you feel full, and the definition for that is really related to satiety. Satiety is this feeling of fullness after a meal. Normally, if you consume a lot of fiber in your diet, you feel pretty full, and you're less likely to eat on other foods that maybe are not so good for you. Last benefit of fiber is it helps kind of normalize your bowel functions. So if you eat a lot of fruits and vegetables and whole grains, your bowel patterns are probably pretty regular, and you don't have digestive problems like constipation or diarrhea and things that are kind of unpleasant. So fiber is definitely good for you. Unfortunately, Americans really fall short of fiber. We just don't get enough in our diets. So that's why sometimes people will turn to supplements. So what else do we need to know about fiber? Lots of benefits. How does it really work? Well, when we consume, let's say, some asparagus, right? Asparagus contains fiber that would really kind of pass through our digestive system, pull on some of the water in our system, or water in the digestive system. It would shorten transit time and allowed for that food residue to pass through our system and then add to your fecal bulk, basically, and make you then go to the bathroom pretty normally and regularly. What else does fiber do for us? Well, it helps regulate blood glucose levels, and beyond fiber, there are things called hormones that help regulate blood glucose levels. The two main ones you need to know about are insulin and glucagon. So insulin and glucagon are both pretty much made by the pancreas. If you've studied anatomy and physiology, you may know this already, but the pancreas secretes these two hormones, and they both kind of work in different directions. So insulin enables your peripheral tissues to take up glucose. So for example, if you just had a can of Coke, Coke has a lot of sugar in it, right? Especially if it's a regular Coke. You'd consume that, your blood sugar levels would naturally go up because you just consumed sugar from Coke. When your blood sugars are up, the pancreas would then respond by releasing insulin, and the insulin would work to then normalize those blood sugar levels and bring them down to a normal level. Glucagon, on the other hand, kind of works in the opposite direction. So it would kind of raise blood glucose concentrations. And again, in periods like starvation, or if you haven't eaten in maybe even 4 hours and you're not starving, but it's been a while since you last ate, your blood sugar might be low. So glucagon would help to kind of stimulate your liver to release some glucose in order for your blood sugar to rise to a normal level. What happens though when our blood sugar levels get dangerously low? Something called hypoglycemia, which technically is defined by low levels of sugar in the blood. I don't know about any of you, but I've definitely experienced hypoglycemia just being a busy grad student and working and maybe forgetting to eat once in a while. It is really not a good thing. It can result in weakness, hunger, dizziness. Your blood sugar levels get to a dangerously low level. You may feel tired or fatigued. And just think about that in terms of an athlete or in a sports nutrition context. When blood sugar levels are low, that impairs your exercise performance. You're less likely to perform well when your blood sugar is low. You want to make sure those levels are at a steady rate. And certainly when we go for a really prolonged time of having these consistently low blood sugar levels, can be really dangerous. It can result in a loss of consciousness and even irreversible brain damage. So Please make sure that you're eating on a regular schedule. Certainly if you're someone who's diabetic as well, blood sugar levels need to be regulated to make sure you're at that normal range. Okay, we're going to fall back to lipids. In the last lecture, I know I introduced lipids to you. And remember, these are just a group of compounds. Oils and fats all fall under this umbrella of lipids. And just to refresh, they have a similar structure compared to carbohydrates, including carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. This slide I actually made myself. You won't find it in your textbook or anything, but when I think about lipids, I think about it as kind of like a family. So triglycerides, I know I've introduced this to you already, but this is the most common type of lipid that we find in food, about 95%. And then we have two other types of lipids that we tend to kind of forget about as scientists. Phospholipids. These lipids are actually components of all of your cell membranes. And then we have sterols. So sterols is a lipid. It's actually a type of steroid. An example would be cholesterol. Remember, structurally, they all contain carbon, hydrogen, oxygen. None of them dissolve in water. So I don't know how many of you have experimented at home, but if you try to take something like a salad dressing and mix it with water, they're not soluble in each other, right? Because that salad dressing contains some oil, and oil and water don't really mix very well, so it would not dissolve. Just keep that in mind. And lipids are energy dense, so they give us 9 calories per gram, which is the most compared to the other two macronutrients. Okay, so triglycerides, we'll spend a little bit more time on this because this is one of the major lipids. It contains three fatty acids connected to the glycerol backbone. And these fatty acids, sometimes people get confused. Each individual fatty acid does have a name. We won't go over that in this class since we're not studying chemistry, but just know there are specific nomenclature for naming fatty acids, and most of the fat in our diet is in this form. Other things to know about these individual fatty acids is that there are differences in how the bonds between these carbons are in the fatty acid itself. So some fatty acids are considered saturated, and in terms of what does that mean, that means all these carbons are bonded together with single bonds. They do not form any double bonds. So if you looked at a fatty acid chain where all of it was saturated, you wouldn't see any double bonds or kinks in that chain. Unsaturated fatty acids, however, contain one or more double bond along the main carbon chain. So examples of unsaturated fatty acids are mono and polyunsaturated fatty acids. These fatty acids you tend to find in more plant sources of fat, so things like canola oil, olive oil, grapeseed, avocado oil, etc. Those would contain more of these, what's known as generally healthier fatty acids for your health. This is kind of a chemistry picture to help you kind of visualize this a little bit better. So you can see in the top part of this slide, that's what a saturated fatty acid would look like. All these carbons are arranged in a nice kind of single row. There's no double bonds or anything around the carbons, or I should say between the carbons. In the bottom half of this slide, this isn't a pictorial representation of an unsaturated fatty acid. There's one or more double bond, which kind of causes that chain to kink a little bit. You can see that yellow kind of overarching line shows that the chain is kinked, and that's due to the one or more double bond present in the unsaturated fatty acid. Okay, essential fatty acids, this is really important to know because similar to amino acids, there's some things that our body can't make. Our body is pretty unique in that it can do a lot for us, but it just can't make certain things, and that includes essential fatty acids. So we have to make sure that we get these from the diet as well. What are the types of essential fatty acids? Well, we have linoleic acid, which is also referred to as omega-6 polyunsaturated fatty acids. and we had alpha-linolenic and other omega-3s and oleic acid. So where would you find these fatty acids? I just told you you have to make sure you get them in your diet. So things like fatty fish, salmon, flaxseed or flaxseed oil, tuna, pretty much, the supply is kind of limited. For that reason, some people often take supplements, which can be expensive, but when you think about where they're found in food, it actually is fairly limited. Luckily, we don't need a ton of it in our diet, just a couple of milligrams a day, but oftentimes that's really hard for people, especially if you're on a food budget and can't afford to buy something like a fatty fish. All right, protein. So another macronutrient, and as a review, remember proteins are formed from amino acids, which are our building blocks. And if you remember or recall that pictorial representation I showed you, the side chain of the protein indicates its structure and function, and those peptide bonds help to hold together these amino acids. There's 20, again, as a reminder. The body can't make 9 of those 20 amino acids. And remember, those are essential, so we have to make sure we get them in the diet, whereas the other are non-essential. There's 11 of those, and thankfully our body does make those. So really you need to focus on the essential amino acids. Of the essential amino acids, I think it's important to highlight leucine. Leucine is an essential amino acid that's received a lot of attention lately, mostly because there's a lot of science to show that leucine helps to stimulate muscle protein synthesis. So if you're someone who is really active and trying to gain muscle mass or just maintain your muscle mass, you want to make sure you're getting leucine in your diet. Where can you get leucine? Mostly animal sources, so things like dairy products, meat, milk, as I've already mentioned, are pretty much your best bet. We'll move on to this concept known as complete versus incomplete proteins. So I've already taught you about the 20 amino acids. So important to know that an essential amino acid is basically a complete protein because it gives us all 9 of the ones we need to function on a daily basis and to allow for tissue growth and repair. So that's not really a problem if you're someone who has meat in your diet, if you eat a lot of dairy products, chicken, so on and so forth. However, this gets complicated for vegetarians. When someone excludes meat, dairy, other animal sources of protein out of their diet, they can lack some of those essential amino acids, and therefore, their diet is kind of incomplete because they're missing some of those essentials. So that's where this concept of incomplete protein comes in, because you're lacking one or more essential amino acid. So my advice to you is, if you're a vegetarian or someone who's just excluding one type of animal source of protein, is really to pair your plant sources of protein together. Reason being is some plant sources contain, maybe a few amino acids, but they lack the other. And then you pair that with another plant source of protein. That other plant source may contain the amino acids your first source was missing. Great example is having rice and beans. So that's this idea of complementary proteins. Rice contains, some amino acids, but maybe it's missing one, like methionine. You eat the beans contains the methionine. So those together will give you the amino acids you need. Okay, we're going to finish off this lecture with the nutrition facts label. This is a pretty quick overview of the nutrition facts label. I hope to go over more of this information in detail with you, but it's really relevant because everyone eats food every single day, right? And when you're buying packaged food, it's important to understand how to read and interpret a label. So this example comes from your textbook. It's kind of an older example, but this is bread, right? So if you look, one of the first things to notice about a nutrition label is the serving size. The serving size for this is 1 slice of bread, right? So it's telling you 1 slice, 36 grams. All of the information then displayed on this label is for 1 slice of bread. Some of the common mistakes or challenges I've seen when working with clients or different students or different populations is they misinterpret the information on the label, and they think that the information listed is for the entire package or for the entire loaf of bread. So that's why really paying attention to these numbers will help you, especially if you're trying to maintain a healthy lifestyle. The Food and Drug Administration actually not so recently anymore, it was like back in 2016, they proposed some changes to the nutrition label. Why? Well, we have new science to show that there are some nutrients that Americans are not getting, therefore we have to list them on the label now. Also, they felt the label was outdated and old. It hadn't changed in like over 40 years. And they just wanted to make it easier for people to comprehend. So I actually got this off the Food and Drug Administration website. I've included the link below if you're interested in kind of diving in a little bit more. But I really like this picture because it highlights what's new, what's different, what is going to change. So the way the regulations read now is that all food manufacturers have to comply with nutrition label change by 2018. There's been a lot of pushback on that because when you think about the food you have in your pantry and all those labels that have to be redone, it's expensive to reprint all those labels, to hire people or extra people to kind of work on this huge project really that's occurring across all of the food industry. So there are some pushback to this. The regulations may become extended. So I wouldn't be surprised if it goes past 2018. But a lot of manufacturers have already complied, so some of you may already see new labels as you're purchasing products, while others may see the same original label. So don't get confused when you're out there in the market purchasing things. You may see a blend of both at this point. So what are some of the main differences? The top serving sizes are larger and in bolder type. And that's really an effort for people to understand the servings per container. You can see that calories are huge, in my opinion. They're bolder, they're in larger type, and that's really so people see that right up front. How many calories are in one serving of this product? They're updating the daily values, and the daily values really just help you put the nutrients in a product in perspective to how much you're allowed to have for the whole day. So in this example, fiber, one serving of this product gives you maybe 14% of the daily value for fiber. So that's kind of like a food budget. That really means then you have 86% of your daily value left for fiber throughout the course of the entire day. So this one serving only gives you 14%. You still have 86% left. That's how I kind of look at it. One of the biggest changes is now we're going to put added sugars on the label. That has never been done before. And there's a lot of trouble around this because most people don't understand what is an added sugar, what counts for that, right? So we'll spend a whole nother lesson understanding what added sugar is. I like to think of it of anything extra that you're adding to a food product, whether that be sucrose or high fructose corn syrup or something that is just not naturally inherent in a product. When you think about milk or chocolate milk, the natural sugar in milk is lactose. If you're then adding chocolate flavoring and sweeteners, all that stuff is added, really. So hopefully this is interesting to you. I know it's been a really hot topic in the nutrition world. This I also like. It's kind of a side-by-side comparison to just show you differences between the old label and what we'll start seeing out there in grocery stores and out in the market. So as you can see, things are a lot bigger and bolder, as we've already mentioned. We'll end this lesson with another practice problem because I want the class to be able to apply what we know about energy coming from carbs, protein, and fat to a simple calculation. So here we have this hamburger. If I were to give you this information and tell you this burger altogether contains 39 grams of carbohydrates, 32 grams of fat, and 30 grams of protein. So how many calories in total do we have coming from each of these nutrients and in the entire hamburger? It's pretty easy, right? I taught you guys that carbs have 4 calories per gram, fat has 9, and protein has 4. So you just take, if I go back here, each of these numbers, 39, 32, and 30, and multiply it by their respective physiological fuel values. So as you can see, if you work through this calculation, this hamburger has in total 564 calories. You'll definitely see a problem like this on Moodle and in your quiz this week. I believe that's it for this lesson. Thanks so much for your attention. Bye-bye.